In the summer of 1942, Guadalcanal was a name that appeared on few maps and meant nothing to most military planners. It was one of hundreds of obscure islands scattered across the Solomon Chain in the South Pacific, roughly 900 miles northeast of Australia. The island stretched about 90 miles long and 25 miles wide, covered almost entirely by dense jungle that had never been fully explored. A few coastal plantations existed, maintained by a handful of Australian colonists who had carved tiny clearings from the overwhelming vegetation. Beyond those clearings, the interior was terra incognita, mapped by guesswork and aerial photographs, that showed nothing but an unbroken canopy of green. The Japanese military had seized Guadalcanal in May 1942 as part of their relentless expansion across the Pacific. Their interest was purely strategic and remarkably limited. They wanted one thing: to build an airfield on a flat coastal plain near Lunga Point on the northern shore. From this airfield, Japanese aircraft could threaten Allied supply lines to Australia and support further operations southward. The airfield required perhaps 2 square miles of cleared land. The rest of the island, all 2,000 square miles of it, was irrelevant to Japanese planning. Construction began in June 1942 using Korean laborers and a small detachment of Japanese engineers. The work progressed quickly on the coastal plain, where the ground was relatively flat and the vegetation manageable. Nobody paid attention to the jungle that began just a few hundred yards inland. It was background, scenery, terrain to be avoided. Japanese forces remained concentrated on the coast, where supply ships could land, and where the open ground allowed for organized military operations. When American Marines landed on August 7, 1942, in the first Allied offensive of the Pacific War, they found the airfield nearly complete and lightly defended. The initial landing was almost anticlimactic. Marines stormed ashore expecting fierce resistance, and instead found confused Japanese construction workers fleeing into the jungle. Within 24 hours, the Americans controlled the airfield and the immediate coastal area. The ease of the landing created a false impression that Guadalcanal would be a straightforward operation. What nobody understood yet, neither American nor Japanese, was that the real enemy on Guadalcanal was not the opposing army. It was the island itself. The jungle that both sides had dismissed as irrelevant backdrop was about to become the primary killer in a campaign that would last 6 months and consume over 30,000 Japanese lives. Not from American bullets, but from something far more relentless and less forgiving than any human enemy. The jungle began abruptly where the coastal plain ended. One moment you walked through grass and scattered palm trees with clear sightlines extending hundreds of yards. The next moment, you stepped into a world where visibility dropped to 10 feet and the sky disappeared behind layers of interlocking canopy. The vegetation was not a single layer, but multiple ecosystems stacked vertically. The canopy towered 150 feet overhead, giant tropical hardwoods whose trunks rose straight for 80 feet before branching. Below that, a secondary canopy of smaller trees competed for the filtered light. Below that, dense understory vegetation filled every gap. At ground level, ferns, vines, and rotting vegetation created a spongy floor that shifted underfoot. The density was almost incomprehensible to anyone who had not experienced it. A Marine later described trying to cut through with a machete and making perhaps 50 yards progress in an hour of exhausting work, only to discover that without a compass and landmarks, he could not tell which direction he had come from or which direction led back to open ground. The jungle was not just difficult terrain. It was disorienting, claustrophobic, and actively hostile to human movement. Temperature and humidity operated in ranges that human bodies could barely tolerate. Daytime temperatures regularly exceeded 95 degrees Fahrenheit, but the closed canopy trapped the heat like a greenhouse. Humidity stayed above 85% constantly, often reaching 100%. Sweat did not evaporate. It soaked clothing until uniforms rotted. Metal equipment corroded within days. Leather molded, paper disintegrated. The air itself felt thick, requiring effort to breathe, as though the atmosphere carried physical weight. Rain came daily, not gentle showers, but torrential downpours that lasted for hours. The jungle did not absorb this water, but channeled it through a million pathways, creating instant streams where none had existed moments before. The ground became sucking mud that swallowed boots. Trails disappeared. Foxholes filled with water faster than men could bail them out. And when the rain stopped, the humidity simply intensified as the moisture evaporated back into the saturated air. The insect life was overwhelming in scale and aggression. Mosquitoes swarmed in clouds so thick that breathing without inhaling them required covering your face. They carried malaria, dengue fever, and other tropical diseases. Flies of every description covered food within seconds of exposure. Leeches dropped from trees and attached themselves to any exposed skin, drawing blood until forcibly removed. Fire ants created nests in the most inconvenient locations and attacked anything that disturbed them. Spiders the size of a human hand lurked in every dark space. At night, the insect noise created a wall of sound that made verbal communication difficult. Beyond insects, the jungle harbored larger creatures that posed less physical threat, but added to the psychological burden. Crocodiles inhabited the rivers and coastal swamps, large enough to take a man if given opportunity. Wild pigs crashed through the underbrush at night, their sounds indistinguishable from approaching soldiers. Enormous fruit bats, with wingspans exceeding 3 feet, roosted in the canopy and descended at dusk in swarms. Snakes, some venomous, were ubiquitous. The Marines who landed on Guadalcanal came mostly from temperate climates where forests were familiar and manageable terrain. This was something different. Within days, Marines learned that the jungle was worse than Japanese fire in many ways. You could take cover from bullets. You could predict where enemies might attack from. But the jungle gave no respite, no safe areas, no predictable patterns. It pressed in from all sides simultaneously 24 hours a day, sapping strength and morale in ways that combat alone could not. For the Japanese forces, who would soon arrive in large numbers, coming mostly from similar temperate regions of Japan or from urban backgrounds, the jungle would prove even more devastating. Their doctrine and training had prepared them for many forms of warfare, but not for combat against terrain that killed more effectively than any weapon. In late August 1942, Japanese Imperial Headquarters in Tokyo received reports that American forces had captured the Guadalcanal airfield and were establishing defensive positions. The initial reaction was not alarm, but irritation. This was supposed to be a secure rear area. The Americans had no business being there, and they would be thrown back into the sea with a sharp counterattack. The plan developed by Japanese commanders demonstrated both supreme confidence and fundamental misunderstanding of what they faced. A regiment-sized force of approximately 900 men from the elite Ichiki detachment would land east of the American perimeter, march west along the coast, and recapture the airfield in a night assault. This force was considered more than adequate. Intelligence estimates suggested the Americans had only about 2,000 Marines on the island, likely demoralized and disorganized. The Ichiki detachment had fought in China and Manchuria. They were experienced, well-trained troops who had never failed in an assault. The operation would take perhaps 48 hours. Colonel Kyonao Ichiki, commanding the detachment, held American fighting ability in open contempt. He had studied reports from Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, and Singapore, where Japanese forces had achieved stunning victories against Western militaries. American troops were soft, dependent on material comforts, lacking the spiritual strength that came from Bushido discipline. They would break under a determined bayonet charge. As so many enemies had broken before, the Ichiki detachment landed on August 18, 1942, at Taivu Point, about 20 miles east of the American perimeter. The landing went smoothly. The troops were in excellent condition, well supplied with ammunition and rations for several days. They began their march west along the coastal track, expecting to reach the American positions within a day. What Colonel Ichiki did not know because Japanese intelligence on Guadalcanal was almost non-existent, was that there were not 2,000 Marines on the island. There were over 10,000, with more arriving daily. The Marines had established strong defensive positions, with interlocking fields of fire, barbed wire, mines, and pre-registered artillery coordinates. They were dug in, supplied, and waiting. This cheeky detachment approached the marine perimeter on the night of August 2021. They could see the airfield in the distance, exactly where it was supposed to be. Colonel Ichiki ordered a frontal assault across the Ilu River, following classical Japanese infantry doctrine, aggressive night attack. Emphasis on speed and shock, soldiers screaming battle cries to unnerve the enemy. The Marines heard them coming. When the Japanese infantry charged across the sandbar at the river mouth, they ran into concentrated machine gun fire, artillery and mortars that had been carefully positioned for exactly this kind of attack. The slaughter was methodical and complete. Wave after wave of Japanese soldiers charged into the fire, refusing to retreat, following orders to take the position at any cost. By dawn, over 800 men of the Ichiki detachment were dead. Colonel Ichiki, recognizing the magnitude of his defeat, burned his regimental colors and committed suicide. The survivors, perhaps 100 men, fled east into the jungle. It was their first encounter with terrain they had never trained for. Wounded, demoralized, without supplies, they plunged into vegetation so dense that organized retreat was impossible. Most of these survivors would die in the jungle over the following weeks. Not from American pursuit, but from starvation, disease, and disorientation. Their bodies would never be recovered. Japanese headquarters received fragmentary reports of the disaster and made a critical decision. The failure was attributed not to faulty intelligence or inadequate force, but to the weakness of the Ichiki detachment. The solution was obvious: send more troops. Many more troops. If 900 men were insufficient, send 6,000. If 6,000 failed, send 20,000. The concept of overwhelming force had always worked before. It would work here. Nobody questioned whether the island itself might be the problem. Throughout September and October 1942, the Japanese Navy executed a brilliant logistical operation known to the Americans as the Tokyo Express. Fast destroyers and cruisers would race down the Solomon Island chain at night, arrive off Guadalcanal after dark, rapidly offload troops and supplies, and retreat before dawn when American aircraft from the captured airfield could attack them. This allowed Japan to land thousands of troops on Guadalcanal despite American control of the surrounding waters during daylight hours. The ships deposited soldiers at various points along the coast, usually west of the marine perimeter. The landing sites were chosen for naval accessibility, not for the terrain the troops would subsequently have to cross. Ship captains wanted deep water close to shore, locations where they could approach quickly, unload, and depart. What lay inland from these landing sites was unknown and considered irrelevant. By late October 1942, Japan had landed over 20,000 troops on Guadalcanal. This was now the largest concentration of Japanese ground forces engaged with Americans in the entire war. General Harukichi Hyakutake himself, commander of the 17th Army, had arrived to personally oversee what Tokyo expected to be the decisive battle that would throw the Americans off the island permanently. The plan was straightforward and followed established Japanese military doctrine. Forces would converge on the American perimeter from multiple directions simultaneously. The main attack would come from the south, where a large force under Major General Masao Maruyama would march through the jungle, emerge behind American lines, and assault the airfield from an unexpected direction. Secondary attacks would pin American forces along the perimeter. Coordinated naval gunfire and air attacks would support the offensive. The operation was scheduled for October 23, 1942. What made this plan theoretically sound was its complexity and coordination. What made it practically impossible was the terrain through which General Maruyama's force had to move. His 7,000 men would have to march approximately 15 miles through the interior jungle. maintaining unit cohesion, carrying heavy weapons and ammunition, and arriving at the attack position on schedule and in fighting condition. The maps used for planning this operation were grossly inaccurate. They showed the interior of Guadalcanal as relatively flat terrain with scattered vegetation. Japanese planners estimated the march would take 3 days at most. Guides would be recruited from troops already on the island who presumably knew the terrain. Artillery pieces would be manhandled through the jungle to provide fire support. Everything would proceed according to schedule. General Maruyama began his march on October 16, 1942. His troops were in good condition, well supplied and motivated. They carried rations for 10 days, ammunition for sustained combat, and heavy weapons, including battalion guns and mortars. The column stretched for miles as it entered the jungle south of the perimeter. Scouts led the way, cutting trails with machetes. Behind them, thousands of men followed in single file. The only way movement was possible through the dense vegetation. Within hours, the march began to fall apart. The trails did not exist. The maps were fantasies. What Japanese planners had assumed were trails were actually stream beds that became raging torrents after rain. What they had marked as flat terrain were actually steep ridges, separated by ravines that required exhausting climbs, followed by treacherous descents. The jungle was not scattered vegetation, but impenetrable walls of interlocking vines, trees, and undergrowth. Progress slowed to a crawl. Scouts cutting trail forward could manage perhaps 200 yards per hour, and the main column could only follow as fast as the trail was cut. This meant the lead elements might advance a mile in a day, while the rear elements had not yet left their starting point. The column fragmented as gaps opened between units. Officers lost contact with their subordinates. The careful coordination required for the planned assault dissolved into simple survival movement. The heavy weapons became impossible burdens. Artillery pieces that required 6 men to carry on roads required 20 men in the jungle, and even then, the carriers were exhausted within hours. Battalion guns weighing hundreds of pounds had to be manhandled up slopes using ropes, with dozens of men straining to move each piece a few yards at a time. Mortars and their ammunition proved too heavy for sustained carrying. Units began caching weapons along the trail, intending to retrieve them later. Knowing they were effectively abandoning them, ammunition boxes, each weighing 30 to 50 pounds, exhausted the men carrying them. Soldiers began discarding rounds to lighten their loads, keeping only what they could carry and still function. The careful logistics planning that had allocated specific ammunition, quantities per man and per unit evaporated as individual. Soldiers made survival decisions about what weight they could bear. Food supplies disappeared faster than planned. The physical exertion of moving through the jungle burned calories at rates nobody had anticipated. Rations calculated for 10 days were consumed in 5 because men were constantly hungry, their bodies demanding fuel for the relentless effort. Water was paradoxically scarce despite the humidity. The streams were often contaminated. Canteens emptied quickly in the heat. Men drank from any available source, disregarding purification procedures, guaranteeing dysentery would follow. Sleep was nearly impossible. The column moved during the day and collapsed at night, but the terrain offered no flat ground. Men slept on slopes wedged between trees or in mud. The insect life made rest a torment. Mosquitoes attacked in swarms. Leeches appeared on bodies every morning. The noise of the jungle, a constant cacophony of insects, birds, and unknown creatures, prevented deep sleep, even when exhaustion demanded it. Rain came daily, turning the trails into streams. Men slipped and fell constantly. Injuries accumulated, minor individually but crippling in aggregate. Twisted ankles, cut hands, infected scratches, heat exhaustion, all reduced combat effectiveness. Medical supplies were limited and soon exhausted. Wounded men who could not keep pace were left behind with promises that help would return. Promises that everyone knew were lies. By October 20th, 4 days into a march planned for 3, General Maruyama's force had covered perhaps 8 miles of the required 15. His men were exhausted, hungry, increasingly sick, and losing combat capability with every hour. Artillery had been abandoned. Heavy weapons were gone. Ammunition was critically low. Unit cohesion was fragmenting. Yet the schedule demanded the attack proceed as planned. Tokyo expected results. The coordinated offensive could not be delayed because one component was struggling. General Maruyama sent messages forward, ordering the attack to proceed on schedule. His subordinates received these orders with disbelief. The men were in no condition to fight. Many could barely walk. They had not reached their attack positions. They did not know exactly where they were because navigation in the closed canopy was nearly impossible. But orders were orders. On the night of October 23-24, remnants of Maruyama's force, perhaps half his original 7,000 men still capable of combat, stumbled out of the jungle behind American lines and attempted to execute the planned assault. They were disorganized, exhausted, and undersupplied. They attacked into prepared Marine positions with interlocking fields of fire. The Marines, who had been warned by intelligence that an attack was coming, were ready. The battle that followed was less a coordinated assault than a series of desperate charges by small groups of Japanese soldiers who had lost contact with their units and their commanders. Some groups fought with fanatical courage, pressing attacks until annihilated. Others, too exhausted to continue, simply collapsed in the jungle and waited for whatever came next. By dawn on October 25th, the offensive had failed completely. Over 2,000 Japanese soldiers were dead. The survivors retreated back into the jungle from which they had emerged. General Maruyama's force, once 7,000 strong, would never fight as a cohesive unit again. Most of those 7,000 men would die on Guadalcanal, not from this battle, but from what followed. The slow dissolution of an army trapped in a jungle that offered no mercy. After the failed October offensive, thousands of Japanese soldiers remained scattered throughout Guadalcanal's interior and along its coasts. They occupied no coherent positions. They controlled no supply lines. They had no unified command structure beyond desperate radio messages that increasingly went unanswered. They simply existed in the jungle, trapped between the impossibility of advancing against American positions and the impossibility of evacuating from an island where the Americans controlled the sea and air during daylight. The Tokyo Express continued to bring supplies, but the quantities were insufficient for the number of troops on the island, and distribution was nearly impossible. Supplies landed at coastal points under Japanese control, but moving them inland required porters and trails, neither of which existed in adequate numbers. Food, medicine, and ammunition accumulated at landing sites, while soldiers miles away in the jungle starved. Hunger became the defining experience for Japanese forces on Guadalcanal. Rice rations, which should have provided 2,000+ calories per day, shrank to a handful of rice that might provide 500 calories. Men consumed grass, roots, and tree bark. They caught insects and ate them raw. They hunted the jungle, but the wildlife was scarce and wary. A soldier might spend an entire day trying to catch a lizard. When units found abandoned Allied supply dumps, they fought over cans of food like starving animals, which they were becoming. Malaria spread through the Japanese forces like wildfire. Nearly every soldier contracted the disease within weeks of entering the jungle. The symptoms were devastating. High fever alternating with chills, severe headaches, nausea, and exhaustion. Without treatment, malaria could be fatal. With treatment using quinine, it was manageable. But Japanese medical supplies were almost non-existent. Men suffered through malarial episodes with no medication, lying in the mud, shaking uncontrollably while their fever spiked to dangerous levels. Then recovering just enough to continue existing before the next episode hit. Dysentery, caused by contaminated water and poor sanitation, struck with equal ferocity. Soldiers suffered constant diarrhea that dehydrated them rapidly in the heat. The combination of dysentery and inadequate food was lethal. Bodies could not absorb what little nutrition was available. Men became walking skeletons, their bodies consuming muscle tissue to survive. Their immune systems collapsed, making them vulnerable to every infection the jungle offered. Dengue fever, another mosquito-borne disease, added to the medical catastrophe. The symptoms mimicked malaria, but were often more painful, earning the disease its nickname breakbone fever for the intense joint and muscle pain it caused. Soldiers infected with dengue could not march, could not fight, often could not even stand. They lay in the jungle while their fevers raged and their bodies deteriorated. Tropical ulcers developed from the smallest cuts and scratches. In the humid, contaminated environment, wounds would not heal. Instead, they became infected, spreading into open sores that expanded to horrifying sizes. Soldiers watched their flesh rot while they were still alive, the ulcers eating through skin and muscle, sometimes exposing bone. Without antibiotics, these infections were almost impossible to stop. Men died from what began as a minor scratch. The psychological deterioration matched the physical decline. Soldiers trained to obey orders found themselves in situations where no orders could save them. They were trapped, starving, diseased with no rescue coming. Some simply gave up, sitting down in the jungle and waiting to die. Others wandered aimlessly, their minds breaking under the stress. Units that had maintained discipline for weeks or months dissolved as survival instinct overrode training and loyalty. Instances of surrender, almost unthinkable under Japanese military code, began to occur. Not in large numbers, but individual soldiers or small groups would emerge from the jungle and give themselves to American forces, choosing captivity over certain death. These men faced not only dishonor, but the knowledge that their families in Japan would be shamed by their actions. Yet they surrendered anyway, because the alternative was worse. Death from starvation and disease does not happen quickly. It is a slow process where the body shuts down in stages. First comes the weakness, the inability to march or carry equipment. Then the mental fog, the difficulty concentrating or making decisions. Then the wasting as the body consumes its own tissues. Then organ failure as kidneys or liver or heart simply stop functioning. Finally, death, often alone in the jungle with no one to witness or record it. The Americans did not fully understand what was happening in the jungle interior. Marine and Army patrols occasionally encountered Japanese soldiers in such advanced states of starvation that they could barely move. Bodies were found weeks or months later, skeletal remains in rotted uniforms. The Americans attributed these deaths to their combat superiority, which was partly true. But the larger truth was that the jungle was doing most of the killing. By December 1942, Japanese imperial headquarters finally acknowledged that Guadalcanal could not be held. The decision to evacuate was made in Tokyo, but executing that evacuation proved nearly as deadly as the fighting had been. The plan called for the Tokyo Express destroyers to rescue the remaining troops in a series of nighttime runs, taking soldiers off the island in reverse of how they had been landed. The evacuation was scheduled for late January and early February 1943. Orders went out to all Japanese units on Guadalcanal to march to designated coastal pickup points on the western end of the island. These pickup points were chosen because they were far from American positions and offered naval accessibility. What the planners in Tokyo did not fully appreciate was that most Japanese soldiers on Guadalcanal were in no condition to march anywhere. Thousands of men, scattered throughout the jungle and along the coasts, received orders to move west. Those still capable of walking began the trek. It was not a military movement but a death march. Men staggered along trails, supporting each other, abandoning equipment that had become too heavy to carry. They had no food supplies for the journey. They had no medical support. They simply walked, hoping to reach the evacuation point before they collapsed. The trail west became lined with bodies. Men would march until their strength gave out, then sit down to rest and never rise again. Comrades could not carry them. Resources did not exist to help them. The brutal calculus was simple: keep moving or die here. Those who could not keep moving were left behind. Small groups of soldiers, too weak to reach the evacuation points, hid in the jungle, hoping the Americans would not find them. Some planned to survive by foraging until rescue could somehow be arranged. Others simply wanted to die on their own terms rather than during the march. These holdouts would remain on Guadalcanal for weeks or months after the official evacuation, slowly succumbing to disease and starvation. The actual evacuations, conducted over 3 nights in early February 1943, were remarkably successful from a naval operations standpoint. Japanese destroyers raced to Guadalcanal, loaded soldiers onto their decks under cover of darkness, and departed before American aircraft could respond. The Navy rescued approximately 10,000 men, a tribute to their planning and execution, but those 10,000 represented only a fraction of the Japanese forces that had been committed to Guadalcanal. When the first Japanese troops had landed in May 1942, they numbered perhaps 2,000 construction workers and guards. By December 1942, Japan had landed over 36,000 soldiers on the island. The evacuation removed 10,000. Simple subtraction suggested 26,000 Japanese had died on Guadalcanal, American combat actions. Fierce and deadly as they were, had killed perhaps 7,000 to 8,000 Japanese soldiers in direct combat. This meant approximately 18,000 to 19,000 Japanese deaths were attributable to disease, starvation, and the environment. The jungle had killed more than twice as many men as American bullets, shells, and bombs combined. The soldiers who were evacuated arrived at rear bases in desperate condition. Many were stretcher cases too weak to walk. Nearly all had malaria. Dysentery was universal. Malnutrition had reduced them to shadows of their former selves. Medical facilities were overwhelmed. Some evacuees died within days of rescue, their bodies simply too damaged to recover, even when food and medicine became available. The evacuated soldiers carried psychological scars that would never heal. They had watched comrades die slowly from starvation. They had left men behind in the jungle, knowing those men would die alone. They had experienced a defeat so complete that it broke something fundamental in their understanding of military operations. Japanese soldiers were supposed to accept death in battle, to embrace sacrifice for the emperor. But death from disease and starvation, death from terrain, death that served no tactical purpose, this was different and deeply demoralizing. The Marines and Army soldiers who fought on Guadalcanal knew they had won a major victory. They had held the airfield against repeated attacks. They had defeated Japanese offensives. They had endured their own hardships, disease, and casualties. When the Japanese evacuated in February 1943, the Americans celebrated their first major ground victory of the Pacific War. What the Americans did not fully understand at the time was how much the jungle had contributed to their victory. Marine patrols that ventured into the interior found evidence of Japanese presence, abandoned equipment, bodies, and trails, but the full scale of Japanese suffering remained hidden. The jungle concealed the dead. The disease victims died alone, unseen. The Americans assumed they were facing a skilled and determined enemy who was simply being outfought. This assumption was partly true, but missed the larger reality. American forces had their own struggles with disease and environment. Malaria struck Americans as readily as Japanese. Dysentery was common. The heat and humidity exhausted American soldiers just as they exhausted Japanese soldiers. But the Americans had advantages that made all the difference. Supply lines were the critical factor. The Americans controlled Henderson Field, the captured airfield, allowing them to bring in supplies, medicine, and reinforcements by air daily. Transport planes landed with quinine for malaria treatment, food, ammunition, and replacement personnel. What could not come by air came by ship during daylight hours, when American naval forces controlled the surrounding waters. The supply situation was never ideal, but it was sustainable. Medical care was another crucial advantage. American forces had established field hospitals with trained doctors and medics. When Marines contracted malaria, they received quinine and rest. When dysentery struck, rehydration and basic care were available. When wounds became infected, antibiotics and surgery were options. The care was primitive by peacetime standards, but it was infinitely better than what Japanese soldiers received, which was usually nothing. American commanders also learned, though slowly, not to fight the jungle directly. Operations were planned around the coastal areas and existing trails. Large-scale movements through the interior were avoided when possible. The terrain was recognized as an obstacle to be respected rather than ignored. This pragmatic approach saved American lives and preserved combat effectiveness. Most importantly, Americans could leave. Guadalcanal was one campaign in a larger war. Units were rotated out, given rest periods in rear areas where they could recover from disease and exhaustion. The island was not a trap. It was a position held for strategic purposes, but not a place where forces were abandoned to die. Japanese soldiers had no such option. Once landed on Guadalcanal, they stayed until victory, death, or the eventual evacuation. The American victory narrative focused on combat actions. The heroic defense of Henderson Field, the courage under fire, the tactical skill displayed in various battles. These things were real and deserved recognition. But the complete story required acknowledging that geography and logistics had been decisive factors. The Americans had won partly by fighting well and partly by not losing to the environment that was killing their enemies. After the Japanese evacuation, American forces expanded their control over Guadalcanal. Patrols pushed further into the interior, establishing outposts and ensuring no significant Japanese presence remained. These patrols routinely discovered bodies, sometimes entire groups of Japanese soldiers who had died together from starvation or disease. The Marines who found these remains had complex reactions. There was satisfaction at enemy losses, but also horror at the conditions that had killed these men. One Marine patrol reported finding a Japanese field hospital in a ravine, dozens of sick and wounded soldiers too weak to move. The Americans provided medical care and food, saving some lives, but many were beyond help. The patrol's report described men weighing perhaps 80 pounds, covered in sores, delirious from fever, lying in their own waste with no one to care for them. This was not combat. This was catastrophe. When military historians compiled statistics after the war, using both American records and captured Japanese documents, the full scale of the Guadalcanal disaster became clear. The numbers were staggering and told a story that individual combat narratives could not convey. Japanese forces committed to Guadalcanal. Approximately 36,000 soldiers landed between May 1942 and January 1943. This figure included combat troops, construction workers, support personnel, and headquarters staff. It represented a major commitment of resources and manpower. Japanese evacuated, approximately 10,000 soldiers removed during the February 1943 evacuation operations. These men were survivors, though many were in critical condition. Japanese deaths. Approximately 26,000 soldiers died on Guadalcanal. This represented a loss rate of over 70%, one of the highest casualty rates for any Japanese operation in World War II. American combat kills. Approximately 7,000 to 8,000 Japanese soldiers killed in direct combat with American forces. This included deaths from gunfire, artillery, naval gunfire, aerial bombing, and close combat. The figure was based on body counts, estimates from combat reports, and post-war analysis. Deaths from non-combat causes. Approximately 18,000 to 19,000 Japanese soldiers died from disease, starvation, accidents, and environmental factors. This figure was calculated by subtracting confirmed combat deaths from total deaths. The actual breakdown was roughly estimated as 60–70% from disease, primarily malaria, dysentery and dengue fever, 20–30% from starvation and malnutrition-related causes, and 10% from accidents, suicide, and other factors. The ratio was stark. For every Japanese soldier killed by American weapons, more than 2 died from the environment and its associated factors. The jungle had been the dominant killer, more effective than the Marines, the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force combined. By comparison, American casualties on Guadalcanal told a different story. Total American deaths were approximately 1,600 killed in action during the 6-month campaign. Disease was a significant problem for American forces, with malaria affecting over 5,000 Marines and soldiers. But access to quinine and medical care kept deaths from disease relatively low. Estimated at fewer than 100, the American casualty rate was roughly 10%, compared to the Japanese rate of over 70%. These numbers reflected fundamental differences in logistics, medical support, and operational planning. American commanders understood that sustaining combat forces required more than tactical skill. It required supply lines, medical infrastructure, and recognition that the environment was a factor to be managed. Japanese commanders, by contrast, had assumed that spiritual strength and tactical aggression could overcome material limitations. Guadalcanal proved this assumption catastrophically wrong. The logistical statistics were equally revealing. American forces on Guadalcanal consumed approximately 4,000 tons of supplies per month, delivered by a combination of air transport and naval convoys. This included food, ammunition, medicine, fuel, construction materials, and replacement equipment. The supply pipeline was never perfect, but it was functional. Japanese forces received approximately 600 to 800 tons of supplies per month through the Tokyo Express runs, and much of this never reached troops in the interior. The supply deficit was unsustainable. Soldiers could not fight on empty stomachs. They could not march while suffering from untreated malaria. They could not maintain morale while watching comrades die slowly from starvation. The medical statistics told their own grim story. American forces had access to quinine for malaria at a rate sufficient to treat cases as they occurred. Japanese forces had minimal quinine supplies, forcing many soldiers to endure multiple malaria episodes without treatment. American forces had sulfur drugs for treating infections. Japanese forces had almost none, resulting in deaths from wounds and conditions that would have been survivable with basic antibiotics. The evacuation statistics completed the picture. Of the 10,000 Japanese soldiers evacuated in February 1943, approximately 3,000 were classified as seriously ill or wounded, requiring immediate hospitalization. Another 4,000 were classified as sick but ambulatory. Only 3,000 were considered fit for duty, though even these men were malnourished and weakened. The evacuation had saved lives, but rescued an army that was physically and psychologically broken. Guadalcanal became a case study in military academies after the war, but not primarily as a tactical or operational lesson. The tactical lessons were straightforward: secure supply lines, maintain air superiority, establish strong defensive positions. These were important, but not revolutionary. The deeper lesson concerned the relationship between military forces and their environment. Modern armies could project power across oceans, land thousands of troops, and execute complex operations, but they could not ignore the basic requirements of human survival. Soldiers needed food, water, medicine, and rest, regardless of their training, discipline, or tactical skill. Denying these requirements did not forge stronger soldiers. It created corpses. Japanese military culture had emphasized spiritual strength over material concerns. The concept of Yamato Damashi, the Japanese spirit, was supposed to overcome physical hardships through sheer willpower. Officers genuinely believed that properly motivated soldiers could endure conditions that would break less disciplined troops. Guadalcanal demonstrated the fatal flaw in this thinking. Willpower could not cure malaria. Determination could not provide calories. Courage could not replace antibiotics. American military culture approached warfare differently, viewing it as an industrial and logistical challenge as much as a test of courage. This perspective came from American civilian culture, where engineering solutions and systematic planning were default approaches to problems. The military had absorbed these civilian attitudes, creating a system that treated soldiers as valuable assets requiring maintenance, not as expendable resources to be consumed. The contrast played out most clearly in medical approaches. Japanese military medicine was primitive, not from lack of knowledge, but from lack of priority. Medical supplies were low on the logistics chain. Sick soldiers were expected to recover through willpower or accept death. American military medicine, by contrast, treated disease as an enemy to be fought with the same resources and intensity as human opponents. The survival rates spoke for themselves. Guadalcanal's environmental challenges were extreme, but not unique. Jungle warfare would characterize much of the Pacific campaign. Burma, New Guinea, the Philippines all featured similar terrain and disease environments. The lessons from Guadalcanal should have informed Japanese planning for subsequent operations. They did not. The same patterns repeated: inadequate logistics, insufficient medical support, soldiers dying from preventable disease and starvation. The Japanese military never adapted to the reality that tropical environments killed more effectively than enemy fire. For American forces, Guadalcanal provided crucial lessons that were absorbed and applied. Medical planning improved dramatically. Quinine stocks were increased. Field hospitals became standard. Rotation policies were implemented to prevent exhaustion. Supply chains were strengthened. These improvements saved thousands of American lives in later campaigns and contributed to the overwhelming American advantage in sustained operations. The environmental lesson extended beyond immediate military applications. Post-war development of tropical medicine, disease control programs, and understanding of malnutrition all benefited from research driven by wartime experiences like Guadalcanal. The realization that winning wars required winning battles against disease and environment led to massive public health investments that had global impact. For the soldiers who survived Guadalcanal on both sides, the memories were dominated not by combat, but by the environment. American veterans remembered the heat, the rain, the mud, the constant presence of disease. Japanese survivors, the few who lived through the entire campaign, remembered starvation with a vividness that never faded. Decades later, in interviews and memoirs, they described the hunger in detail that combat experiences could not match. The psychological impact of slowly starving while surrounded by jungle that offered no sustenance created trauma that exceeded battlefield trauma. The island itself returned to jungle after the war. The airfield was maintained briefly, then abandoned. The defensive positions eroded. The trails disappeared. Within a few years, vegetation reclaimed most evidence that 30,000 men had died there. The jungle, which had devoured an army, simply continued its eternal cycle of growth, decay, and regrowth, indifferent to the human drama that had briefly disturbed its rhythms. Modern visitors to Guadalcanal can walk through the jungle that once killed thousands. It remains dense, hot, humid, and hostile to human comfort. The insects still swarm, the diseases still lurk, the terrain still resists movement. Nothing fundamental has changed about the environment. What has changed is human understanding that such environments must be respected, prepared for, and confronted with resources rather than courage alone. The title of this story suggested that an American jungle devoured a Japanese army. The truth is more complex and more chilling. It was not an American jungle, but simply a jungle, a tropical environment that killed anyone who entered it without adequate preparation and support. The Americans survived not because they were better warriors, but because they brought better logistics. They treated the jungle as an enemy to be defeated through supply lines, medicine, and systematic planning rather than an obstacle to be overcome through willpower. The Japanese army on Guadalcanal was not defeated by American combat power. Though American forces fought skillfully and bravely, it was defeated by its own failure to understand that modern warfare required more than tactical skill and fighting spirit. It required recognizing that soldiers were human beings with biological needs that could not be ignored. When those needs were not met, soldiers died, regardless of their training or courage. The lesson resonates beyond military history. Organizations of all kinds face the temptation to believe that motivation and determination can overcome material limitations. Guadalcanal demonstrated that this belief, however inspiring it may sound, is simply false. Human beings have physical requirements. Meeting those requirements is not optional. Systems that ignore this reality do not forge stronger people. They create preventable tragedy. 26,000 Japanese soldiers died on Guadalcanal. Most of their bodies were never recovered. They remain in the jungle still, absorbed into the ecosystem that killed them. Their sacrifice achieved nothing strategically. The island was lost anyway. Their deaths served no tactical purpose. They died because their commanders sent them into an environment without the resources necessary for survival, expecting willpower to substitute for food, medicine, and supply lines. That is the untold destruction of Guadalcanal. Not the destruction of combat, which was fierce but limited. The destruction of an army by an environment it was unprepared to face. Deaths that were preventable but ignored. A catastrophe that revealed the fatal flaw in military doctrine that prioritized spirit over material reality. The jungle that devoured Japan's army was not uniquely American or uniquely hostile. It was simply a jungle, indifferent to human conflict, operating according to biological and environmental rules that no amount of courage could overcome. Americans won Guadalcanal not through superior fighting, but through superior logistics and medical support. They recognized that winning required keeping their soldiers alive, fed, and healthy. This unglamorous reality, this focus on supply chains and disease prevention, rather than heroic charges, proved decisive. The jungle tested both armies equally. One army passed the test through preparation and resources. The other army failed because it believed preparation and resources were less important than fighting spirit. That distinction, invisible in the dramatic narratives of combat, determined who lived and who died in the green hell of Guadalcanal.